I've said it before and I'll say it again. Music rocks and rules. And so does video games. And if you believe it or not, sometimes music in video games rules.
These days, I feel like it can be easy to take music in video games for granted. Obviously, there are incredible works of music in modern video games, and I don't mean to diminish the works of any artist by saying this, but it was a lot harder to make music for video games back in the day. You couldn't always just drag and drop an audio file into a game and bam, whatever song you want is in there. Back in the day, making any sound at all, let alone music that was memorable and good, was a painstaking process.
So before I talk about Yumiko Kanki, the composer I'd like to highlight in this video, why don't you crawl into my virtual video game hole and I'll time warp you back to dinosaur times and old computers.
In the beginning of games, back in 70s and arcade times, video game music was super basic, and it was pretty much limited to tiny samples of simple tunes used sparsely in between levels or at game over screens or whatever. But then, in 1978, a guy named Tomohiro Nishikaido made a little game called Space Invaders. This game is influential in a lot of ways, but today we're talking about the music. This was the first game to have music continuously playing during a level. Not only that, it was dynamic music too. The simple repeating pattern increases in speed as the aliens approach. But okay, so all the sound was made on this little chip. And I'm not at all an expert on this stuff from a computer standpoint or like an audio engineering standpoint, but basically this is about as much sound as you can make on it. And like one note at a time, and also hard to even make notes at all, so not ideal. And on the home front, the most popular home console, the Atari 2600, was not so hot in the sound department either. But then the NES came out and Koji Kondo changed everything and video game music became dope. This sound processor was a huge step up from its previous console competitors, but still very limiting. There were only 4 channels for sound. In an interview with Koji Kondo, he says 3, but I'm pretty sure there are 4. And the bass and the sound effect channel were the same, so these sounds couldn't play at the same time, cutting the bass track out of the soundtrack when a sound effect was triggered. Despite these limitations, soundtracks in games were starting to be vastly more considered in the creation of a game, and composers were able to create some pretty amazing stuff. Now we're going to skip ahead to where I want to get to. There were definitely lots of other advancements in sound hardware and music and gaming before the Super Nintendo came out, but let's just skip ahead to that. The SNES was a big step up both graphically and aurally from the original NES. It doubled the number of channels and used fully digital audio samples, which allowed composers and programmers to load in their own instrument sounds from the keyboards that they had. In an interview in the book Game Maestro Volume 3 from 2001, Koji Kondo said that it was a huge shift in sound from what he had been doing on the Famicom. It was a truly new sound. He spent a lot of time then thinking about what direction game music should go from here. For Super Mario World, a launch title for the Super Nintendo, he decided that for now, at least, he would try and use sounds that resembled the normal instruments you'd hear in the real world. However, his idea was to arrange the individual instruments in a way that you didn't normally hear, like putting banjo and steel drum together, for instance. This seems to be the precedent set for many SNES composers. While many would attempt to emulate various genres of real-world music, the best ones always knew they couldn't sound 100% unsynthesized, so they would use that to their advantage. Okay, and with all of that out of the way, we can finally get to what I wanted to talk about in this video, Yumiko Kanki, and especially her work on the game F-Zero. You may have noticed that in a video that's supposed to be about Yumiko Kanki, I've been referencing KOJI KONDO a whole lot. Well, that's mainly because there's very little information available online about Yumiko Kanki, at least from what I could find, which was one reason I wanted to make this video actually. I guess reaching out to anyone who knows any more information about her, because I think she's a very important composer in the video game world and I'd like to get her credit, but I will tell you what I could find. Yumiko Kanki was a sound designer working for Nintendo. She worked mostly during the SNES era on titles like F-Zero and Star Fox 2. She was credited as Yumiko Kameya on the F-Zero X Guitar Arrange Edition soundtrack, implying that Kanki may have been her maiden name. It is unknown what her current occupation is. That is all the information I could find about Yumiko Kanki. The only developer interview for F-Zero that I could find was pretty recent, from a series of interviews that Nintendo did to promote the Super NES Classic Edition, and there's no mention of the music or Kanki at all. So I don't have much concrete to go on here, but I'd like to do a little speculating on the music in F-Zero and why I think it's important. F-Zero came at a time where the racing genre needed a big shot of adrenaline. There was something missing in the way that these games were able to communicate high speeds and fast-paced racing action. When Kazunobu Shimizu, the game's director, originally presented a racing game to Nintendo of America, it was a sequel to the top-down racing game Famicom Grand Prix F1 Race. They apparently bashed it and convinced him to go back to the drawing board. At the same time, Yasunari Nishida, the lead programmer, had been tasked with experimenting with programming a racing game using Mode 7. The SNES had 8 modes for various graphical renderings, modes 0 through 7. Mode 7 supported functions like rotating and scaling backgrounds. Nishida used this to stretch and rotate the bottom 4/5 of the screen to simulate the course, bending and twisting, and put background art in the top fifth to simulate the horizon line. To further amp up the juice, they decided to set the game in the future with hyperspeed hover vehicles, wanting to break away from the previous genre conventions and allowing players to reach over 4,000 kilometers per hour. Inside the actual game, there isn't really any story to be told, but the manual does a little bit in providing background information on the context of the race, setting up the aesthetic, introducing us to the characters, and leading into the opening race of the first Grand Prix, which takes place in Mute City. The manual describes Mute City as the biggest city on all of the Space Federation planets. Mute City has prospered from intergalactic trade and boasts a population of more than 200 million, so the music needed a sound that would capture the pulse of a bustling intergalactic metropolis that serves as a first impression to establish the general mood of the Grand Prix. Well, you tell me if it nails that or not. This is probably the most recognizable and popular piece of music from Yumiko Kanki and F-Zero in general. It's not only a fan favorite, but Nintendo clearly has respect for it as well, remixing it and remaking it for other games like 10 times. I feel like this song has a huge amount of influence on the 16-bit era of video game music and beyond, being one of the earliest examples of, I don't know exactly what it is, but like future funk or synth rock in gaming that could easily be inspiration for like every single song in Sonic the Hedgehog.
Can't hold on much longer, I will never let go.
I mean, I don't want to overassume, and I don't really have any concrete evidence to go on for music that was directly inspired by this, but just based on how much it's been reused and how much staying power it has in the gaming community, I'm guessing that lots of video game composers were freaking out to this when it was new. Kanki composed all of the music for the game other than 2 tracks, which are credited to Nintendo composer and sound designer Naoto Ishida. He composed the ending theme as well as probably the other most popular track from the game, Big Blue. Okay, so now I don't really have too much analysis left. I just want to highlight some of the underappreciated songs in the game that may not be as familiar to people who haven't actually played the original F-Zero. After the SNES, Nintendo would follow up F-Zero with a few sequels on the N64 and the GameCube, but these days its world and music are only really seeing the light of day in other games like Smash and Mario Kart. I don't think I'm alone in saying that I would love another F-Zero game, but for now we just gotta appreciate that they remixed a bunch of the tracks for Smash Ultimate. So even though Nintendo clearly has a lot of appreciation for her work, where is Yumiko Kanki? The only other game she's credited on is Star Fox 2, which was again made back in the 90s for the Super Nintendo but didn't get an official release until 2017. Kanki hasn't been credited on any other video game music or anything at all from what I can find since then, so you know, I have no idea what she's up to, but I just think that she's an important composer who deserves her dues, and I would love to know if anybody knows any work that she's done since these games, if she's made any more music under a different name or something like that. But yeah, if anybody has any more information about Yumiko Kanki, please reach out because, well, I just said this already, but I think she's good at making music.